So in this video, I'm going to tell you about 4 or 5 things you need to pay attention to if you're installing the suspension rail and using the instruction that comes with the rail, because it's not all good. So keep watching. And while we're at it, please subscribe to my channel right there. Thank you so much.
Before we get to the topic of this video, I just want to share a warning with you, because a few years back I was not paying attention while hanging the rail and while I was handling it in order to cut the rail in two. I hit my shin, and as you can see in this picture, it left quite a big of a gap on my leg there, and I had to go to the emergency room to have 8 stitches to close up that wound and a big band-aid on. And I don't want this to happen to you, so please pay attention when you're handling the rail. So with these things out of the way, we can finally get to what's the problem with the instruction for hanging the rail from Ikea. Well, in general, for Ikea, it's a prerequisite that the walls and the floors and the ceiling are absolutely perfect. That means the floors are horizontal, the ceilings are horizontal and not sagging in the middle, and the walls are flat and vertical. And if you have a house and you've been checking out your own room with a level, you will see that that is not the case. I have never seen a house that was absolutely perfect according to IKEA standards. The ceiling is always sagging a bit away from the wall, and the walls are quite often not absolutely plumb, and the floors are definitely not horizontal. They might be close to horizontal, but not perfectly horizontal. And there's one thing that's for sure, is that the wall is never as flat as intended. And because of this, it can be very difficult to just follow the instructions that comes with the rail, because then you will end up with a result that is not really suitable for having a trouble-free installation when you start hanging the cabinets. The first issue with this instruction is up here in the right-hand corner, where you can see IKEA tried to tell you that you need 6/8 of an inch to the ceiling. 6/8 is what we also call 3/4 if we learn to reduce fractions. So 3/4 of an inch to the ceiling. And the problem right here is that, as I'll show you in a second, is that if your ceiling is not horizontal, if it's sagging, and you put your rail 3/4 of an inch from the ceiling, you might not have the sufficient distance out in the room to open the doors. But the only reason they tell you to have 3/4 of an inch up there is for you to be able to hang the cabinet, because when they're hanging on the rail, you need to kind of lift them up and let them fall down onto the rail, and you need a bit of room for that. But you don't need 3/4 of an inch. If you're short of ceiling height, you can go a little bit closer to the ceiling, but then you need to know that you might have to loosen the bracket on the cabinet, hold up the cabinet, swivel back the bracket, and secure it to the cabinet frame again in order to make it happen. And if you're working alone, that can be quite a hassle. So when I install a kitchen in a room with reduced ceiling height, I do not check the distance from the ceiling to the top of the rail. What I want to do is I want to check the distance from the bottom of the rail, because that's where I put my laser, to the ceiling. And as a minimum, you need 2.5 inches from the bottom of the rail to anywhere on the ceiling where you will have cabinets. Of course, it doesn't matter if there's no cabinet sitting in the vicinity where the ceiling is sagging the most, but you need to check that where you have the cabinets, you have 2.5 inches from the bottom of the rail to the ceiling. If you fail to do so, you might end up in a situation where you cannot open the cabinet doors, and that is not cool. So don't do that. You only need to worry about the distance from the lower edge of the rail to the ceiling if your room do not have sufficient ceiling height. And sufficient is 95 inches and up if you have 40-inch upper cabinets or 90 inches high pantry cabinets. In theory, that means if we have a perfect room, we only need 95 3/4 of an inch, but we know that rooms are not perfect. So if you have anything less than 95 inches, you need to know if the ceiling is sagging in various spots so it comes below and you don't have that necessary ceiling height. So in this video I'm going to show you now, we have reduced ceiling height. It's only 93 inches. So I want to put that rail and the cabinets as close to the ceiling as absolutely possible. But in order to do so, I need to check where my ceiling is sagging the most. So the distance from that very point on the ceiling to the bottom of the rail is not anything less than 2.5 inches. And for checking that, I need my laser. Check this out.
In this case, I have put up the laser so it's sitting with very good distance to the ceiling, so it allows for the cabinets to hang and the doors to open. And as you can see over here, we got about 3 inches. So in general, I could move it up because 2.5 inches is the minimum. The problem here is that this ceiling is really sagging over here. I'm sorry to leave the picture, but we need to have room for the doors to open. This is the fridge next to me here, and the fridge cabinet will be sitting here, and that is protruding from the wall 24 inches. Plus, it's a 30-inch wide cabinet, so the doors are 15, so almost at 40 inches from the wall. We need to have 2.5 inches, and we have that right here. So I cannot really move it any higher up on the wall, even though I got 3.5 in here, because this hanging ceiling is the determining factor for where I can put this rail. In this case, we do not have 95 inches to the ceiling, we only have 93. So the rail has to sit a bit lower. And the condition of the ceiling really determines where I can put the rail. If I was just measuring at the wall and put up my rail with the 2.5 inches in distance from the ceiling to the bottom of the rail, I will not be able to open the doors on this cabinet. So, and that's not a great feature. Doors needs to be able to open. So make sure that you measure the whole room so you find that lowest spot off the ceiling.
And this is how it looked when it was all installed, and it's easy to see that the ceiling is sagging because the cabinet is pretty much touching right here at the corner of the cabinet, and we got about 1 inch of distance from the top of the panel to the ceiling, and about 1 inch over on the left hand side as well. So the ceiling is really coming down, but if I did not make sure that my rail was sitting in the right distance from the lowest spot on that ceiling, I would be in trouble when installing. Now, back at the instruction, it's time to look at the item I circled here, and that is about the length of the rail, how long you want to cut them. And here's what I'm doing when cutting the length of the rail.
The measurement X Ikea refers to in the instruction is the width of the cabinet, or cabinets if you got more than one. And they tell you that that's the length of the rail. And I disagree, because you don't want to have it as long as the total width of the cabinets, because then there is a slight chance that it will be a little bit too long and it'll stick out here at the end. And if it's sticking out, you cannot get the panel on this side. And if it is sticking out or going right to the edge, you have no possibility of adjusting this cabinet a little bit to the side. And since the bracket is not going all the way to the end of the cabinet, but it's sitting in here, you really don't need the rail to have the same length as the width of the cabinet. You can actually make it about 1/2 inch shorter at each end of your cabinet, either right here and here, or wherever that is if you have more than one cabinet. So let's say that you have two cabinets of 18 inches, that's 36. Then you can make the rail 35 and you will have half an inch of clearance here at the end. And that can prove to be a good idea, because if it is too long and you have to cut it, then you're in trouble unless you have the right tools. If it's sitting on the wall and you don't have an oscillating tool with a carbide blade on it, you cannot cut it in place. You have to take the cabinet and the rail down again to cut it. If you do have an oscillating tool with a carbide blade, you can cut it in place. And that's what I do if I sometimes don't pay attention, or I decide to shift it a bit for whatever reason. Then I'll just take my oscillating tool and I'll just cut right into the drywall from this side, whatever is protruding off the rail. And you can do that too, but I suggest that you cut it to the right length the first time. So if you have a string of cabinets that's 72 inches, you cut the rail 71. Then you make sure that it won't be protruding.
The next item on the agenda is the distance between the screws, or how many screws you need in each rail. And as you can see in this sketch, Ikea said you should maximum have 12 inches between the screws. Well, you know that here in Canada or in the US, where we have framed walls most of the time, we have normally 16 or 24 inches between the studs, and that is what Ikea is suggesting here as well. The thing is though, that what do we do in the middle? Because if we have 16 center to center, we don't have a stud right there in the middle. So I guess that Ikea suggests we put some sort of wall anchor or something. Well, I for one do not rely on wall anchors to keep my cabinets up on the wall. I sometimes use a wall anchor if I just want to secure the end of a rail on a base cabinet so it doesn't kind of swing out when I'm in the middle of the installation. But otherwise, I do not support that. As you can see in this video, I'm hanging up the upper rail, which is for the wall cabinets and pantry cabinets, if there is any of those. And the situation is that in most houses where we got framed walls, we do have a 2x4 or similar sitting horizontally at the very top of the wall, because that's how they're built. And that means we have a lot of good opportunities to put in some screws for hanging that rail. In this video, you can see I probably put in a screw for every 12 inches or so, because I really want to make sure that that rail is sitting as tight to the wall as possible. So I suggest you do that too. Check out what you got behind that rail up under the ceiling and put in a lot of screws. Now, when it comes to the lower rail, the situation is different, because we only have the studs that is running vertically in the wall, and sometimes they are not sitting in a favorable position for putting up the rails. However, don't worry about it, because as you can see right here, I'm putting 4 legs on each cabinet, and that means that the rail is only to keep the cabinet tight to the wall. I do not rely on the lower cabinets to be hanging on the rail as support at the wall, because when you put a very heavy countertop like quartz or granite on top of those cabinets, you need some really good fastening into the studs for the cabinets not to start sacking. And that's why I put 4 legs on every cabinet, and I make sure that when they have all been lined, that I lower the legs closer to the wall all the way down to the floor. So in this case, the rail only have one purpose, and that is to keep the cabinet tight to the wall. So keep that in mind when you put the screws on. I sometimes use a wall anchor into the drywall if, for instance, I have a rail protruding from a stud, either left or right with 10 or 8 inches, then I put in a wall anchor just to make sure that it's sitting flat to the wall, but it's not really taking up any forces for coming from the cabinet going in the downwards direction. Next point on the agenda is down here in the left corner. because IKEA want you to make sure that the rail is sitting flat on the wall, because it needs to be absolutely flat or as close to flat as possible. Otherwise, you will have difficulties when you are tying the cabinets in. The method IKEA is suggesting is, in my point of view, is not sufficient. So this is what I do.
So in the instruction, it says that you have to see if there's any room behind this rail, so it's not sitting flat on the wall. And I'm here to tell you that that's not enough. You need to use a second rail, like this one, and then put it on this way. And then you can see whether your rail is flat on the wall. And if it's not, you need to shim it. You need to shim it where you have the drywall going in. And clearly you need to shim it where you have a stud, because otherwise the drywall would just bend, right? And when you're checking with this one, it's really only necessary to check those points where you have a cabinet hanging. If you have a very wide cabinet like the sink cabinet I have in this case, it's going from here to here. What's happening in between is really not that important. What's important is that this spot where the bracket is sitting and this spot and the other spots where the other brackets from the other cabinets are sitting, that they are on a flat, even surface, all of them. And that you can check with another rail. So keep that in mind when you start hanging rails, that you need to have one at the end, so to speak, so you can check, because sometimes it's not that important that it's flat, and quite often it's more flat at the top than at the bottom, because we're so close to the ceiling that 2x4 that runs this way up under the ceiling is quite often more flat than those sitting here vertical. So check that. It's super important, otherwise you'll have problems when you hang the cabinets.
And finally, we get to the last point on this instruction for hanging the rails from IKEA. And this is actually the most important one, because as you can see in this sketch, we have 3 measurements. One measurement for where the rail goes for the base cabinets, one measurement for the upper cabinets and the pantry cabinets if they are 80 inches high or 30 inches high. Or the one to the right, 92 and 3/16 is where we want to put the rail if we have 90-inch high pantry cabinets and 40-inch upper cabinets. The problem is, though, that they're all taking these measurements from the floor, and I guarantee you that your floor is not horizontal. So if you just go ahead and put those measurements on the wall and hang the rails, you will get into trouble. And let me tell you why. So in this kitchen, I have hung 3 base cabinets on the wall, and I started by measure 32 inches and 3/16 from the floor up to the lower edge of the rail. And then I put up the rail. And when the rail is securely fastened to the wall, I will hang up my cabinets. In this sketch, I have not bothered to put on some legs, but you know they will be there eventually, and they have no say in this matter. So let's just focus on the cabinets. Now, next thing I want to do is hang some upper cabinets. So I go ahead and measure 92 inches and 3/16 from the floor to where I want to hang my upper cabinets. And when the rail has been fastened, I can put up 3 uppers that match my lowers. And once again, I step back and I look at it, and I'm pretty pleased with my work because it looks great. Now I decide to add a 90-inch high pantry cabinet to my little kitchen. And that goes on the same rail at the uppers. So let's put that up. There you go. But as you can see, we just ran into some troubles, because now the pantry cabinet is not lining up at the bottom with the base cabinets. And that is despite the fact that we have followed the instructions from IKEA when we put up the rails on the wall. And we cannot have this. It looks awful. It needs to be lined up at the top and at the bottom as well. So how can we go about this if we have a floor that is not horizontal? Well, this is what I do. When I start a kitchen installation, I always plan out where I want to put the rails, and the first rail I measure for is the lower rail. And that is for that obvious reason that we do want the countertop to be at a certain height above the floor. Otherwise, the kitchen will not be nice to work in with a counter that's sitting too low or sitting too high. So 34.5 inches from the floor is the top of the cabinet, and on that we add the thickness of the counters. So start with the lower rail. Now you may be thinking that, but where do I measure from the floor and up? Because if the floor is not horizontal, the height of the finished countertop will depend on where I measure. And yes, that is correct. If your floor is not horizontal, your countertop height will not be the same in the whole room. But since your countertop needs to be horizontal, that is just how it is. What I do is I put a line on the wall with my pencil at 32 inches and 3/16, and then I put up my laser. And then I take my measuring tape and I walk around the room and measure the height from the floor up to the laser line about 2 feet from the wall. Because that's where you will be standing when the kitchen has been installed. You will not be standing at the wall because there's a cabinet. So you need to make sure that your floor is not falling a lot into the room. Imagine that the floor is falling 2 inches, for instance. That's a lot, and it will not do that, but just for the sake of argument, imagine that your floor is falling 2 inches from the wall into the room. That means that if you just measure 32 inches at the wall and put up your rail, the counters will actually be sitting 2 inches higher than you would like them to, because you are standing in a cavity in front of the cabinet. So you need to make sure that your line is sitting 32 inches and a quarter of an inch approximately from the floor where you will be standing. And it may change when you walk through the room like I'm doing in the video. So you just find that medium sweet spot where you say, okay, this is where I want my counters, right? So they're not too high and they're not too low. I always start by measuring around where the range will go, because you don't want the range to sit in a hole and you don't want the range to stick out of the counter. So start by doing that, and then you have baseline for all the cabinet installation. So with the baseline in place, we can move on to the location of the rails for the upper cabinets, and their position depends on whether you have 80-inch pantry cabinets, 30-inch wall cabinets, or 90-inch pantry cabinets and 40-inch wall cabinets. And now we don't measure from the floor. Now we measure from the baseline, and from our baseline we measure either 50 inches or 60 inches. And if you do that, I can guarantee you that your cabinets will line up at the top and at the bottom always. If you're still with me, I just want to thank you for watching with me so far into this video. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's extremely important if you want to have a very good kitchen installation. So on that note, see you on the next one.